USS Louisville, a Northampton-class heavy cruiser, may not share the same level of fame as some of her contemporaries like Indianapolis or San Francisco, but her contributions were no less significant. Known affectionately as Lady Lou, she served with distinction throughout the Pacific Theater, participating in several major campaigns and enduring enemy fire with resilience and tenacity. While history often shines its brightest spotlight on the most dramatic or tragic stories, Louisville's steadfast service is a testament to the critical role played by the U.S. Navy's heavy cruisers in securing final victory. Her story, though less celebrated, deserves recognition as a vital chapter in the annals of U.S. naval history. Louisville's keel was laid down on July 4, 1928, at the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington. She was built in a dry dock and not on a slipway, just as all ships that were built at Puget Sound were. Thus, her launching a little over 2 years later on September 1, 1930, was really just the flooding of the dry dock so she could be taken out. She had the typical American treaty cruiser specs, an overall length of 600 feet, a beam of 66 feet, and she displaced just over 9,000 tons. Louisville's main battery consisted of 9 8-inch 55 caliber guns housed in 3 triple turrets. These had a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second and were capable of firing a 260-pound shell over 30,000 yards at their maximum elevation of 41 degrees. As was typical of the early treaty cruisers, her guns had a rather high dispersion pattern, sometimes as large as 2,000 yards for a full salvo, and this was due to the close proximity of the barrels to one another. This was eventually corrected somewhat in the late 1930s by reducing the muzzle velocity and relining the barrels with a fully chrome-plated bore, but the dispersion problem was never eliminated entirely. Her secondary battery consisted of 4 5-inch 25 caliber dual-purpose guns that were located in open single mounts just aft of her second stack. She also had 2 3-pounder Hotchkiss saluting guns and 6 21-inch torpedo tubes at the time of her commissioning. Louisville was also equipped with 2 aircraft catapults, which were located amidships, and had a hangar for her 4 aircraft that was located in the forward part of her aft deckhouse. While the Northamptons had a thicker armor belt than the preceding Pensacola class, it was still less than desired due to the tonnage limits put in place by the Washington Treaty. Her belt was 3 to 3.75 inches thick, and her deck armor was between 1 to 2 inches thick. Her barbettes were protected by 1.5 inches of armor, and her turrets had 2.5-inch faces, with another 3/4 of an inch protecting their sides. Rated for 107,000 shaft horsepower, Louisville was powered by 8 oil-fired boilers, which generated steam for 4 reduction turbines that each drove a screw. She could make a brisk 32 knots and had a range of 10,000 nautical miles when cruising at 15 knots. Louisville's complement at the time of her commissioning was 621 officers and enlisted men. Louisville was commissioned into the United States Navy on January 15, 1931, and after the usual post-commissioning activities, she got underway in the early summer for her shakedown cruise, which took her from Bremerton to New York City via the Panama Canal. On July 1st, she was redesignated as a heavy cruiser in accordance with the provisions of the London Naval Treaty. She returned to the West Coast in early 1932 and operated out of San Pedro for the next 2 years. She participated in Fleet Problems 13 and 14 during this time, before becoming a training ship for anti-aircraft training during the latter half of 1933. In April 1934, Louisville got underway to begin a 9-month voyage that included port calls in Central America, the Caribbean, and all along the Gulf and East coasts of the U.S. After returning to San Pedro late in the fall, Louisville participated in gunnery and tactical exercises during the winter months before departing in May 1935 for Fleet Problem 15, which took place in the North Pacific. Over the next 2 years, she operated off the West Coast and participated in the 1936 and 1937 Fleet Problems. On July 16, 1937, she collided with the American halibut fishing boat Alton in the harbor at Ketchikan, Alaska. Although Alton was badly damaged, there was no loss of life. In January 1938, Louisville got underway for a long Pacific cruise, during which she made port calls at Hawaii, Samoa, Australia, and Tahiti before returning to Pearl Harbor for Fleet Problem 19 in May. While in Sydney, Australia, Louisville's crew rescued a number of passengers from a sightseeing ferry boat, which had capsized when most of the passengers crowded the rail to wave the cruiser off. For the rest of 1938 and most of 1939, Louisville continued operating off the West Coast, participating in gunnery and tactical exercises, which included Fleet Problem 20 in early 1939. On September 10, 1939, Louisville got underway for a tour of Central and South American waters in an effort to project power and reassure U.S. allies in that part of the world as war began to rage in Europe. She visited Panama, Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina before making her way back to Brazil. During these port calls, Louisville and her crew looked their best for the crowds that gathered on the docks to greet them. Her Marine detachment put on a good show during the presentation of colors, and an open house was held at every stop where citizens of the host nation could tour the ship's decks, passageways, and compartments. In the words of one sailor, "It was a fine time to be a young sailor, and the war in Europe seemed far away." Scuttlebutt had it that the Lady Lou was homeward bound when she weighed anchor at Bahia on the day after Christmas, until Captain H.J. Nelson's voice boomed over the ship's loudspeakers informing his crew that they were on their way to Simonstown, South Africa, to pick up $148 million worth of British gold for delivery to the United States. Louisville was given this duty because a British ship would risk attacks from German submarines and put the valuable cargo at risk. As Louisville eased up to the dock in Simonstown on the morning of January 7, 1940, sailors were astonished at a stack of gold bars stacked up like cordwood. Her Marine detachment quickly took up guard duty. At 10:30 a.m., the job of loading the precious cargo began. Each bar had a serial number that an officer at the gangway recorded as it was brought aboard. After 13 hours, the 220 tons of gold bars had been brought aboard and secured in Louisville's ammunition magazines, with a Marine guard posted at each magazine hatch. The following day, the Lady Lou was splitting the waves for New York at 25 knots. Even though America was neutral at the time, Captain Nelson didn't want to take any chances that his ship might be misidentified by one of the combatant nations. He had sailmakers stitch up 3 huge American flags, 2 of which were displayed on the flat starboard and port sides of the ship. The third was stretched out between the afterstack and aftermast and illuminated by floodlights at night. After 17 days at sea, Louisville docked at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where she was met by a mass of uniformed guards with armored cars, a totally different scene from the docks in Simonstown, where the gold had been almost unattended. Louisville returned to the Pacific in time for Fleet Problem 21 in April 1940, and afterwards spent the rest of the year and most of 1941 training in Hawaiian waters. In November 1941, she got underway for the Western Pacific, and on December 7th, when news of the attack on Pearl Harbor reached her, she was escorting several transport ships back from the Philippines. After stopping in Hawaii briefly to refuel, she continued on her escort mission and arrived in San Francisco on Christmas Day. Louisville stood into San Diego on December 30th, where she was assigned to Task Force 17, which was built around the newly arrived aircraft carrier USS Yorktown. She weighed anchor and got underway on January 6th with the rest of the task force to cover a convoy that was delivering Marines to Pago Pago. After delivering their charges, Task Force 17 turned around and conducted carrier strikes on Mili and Jaluit atolls in the Marshall Islands, followed by Makin Atoll in the Gilbert Islands on February 1st and 2nd. This was Louisville's first offensive action of the war. More strikes followed in mid-March, this time in the vicinity of Lae and Salamaua on the northern coast of New Guinea. Afterwards, Louisville departed the combat zone and headed to the Mare Island Navy Yard for an overhaul. On May 31, 1942, Louisville got underway for the cold waters of the North Pacific to help counter Japanese moves in the Aleutian Islands. For the next several months, she escorted convoys throughout the island chain and patrolled for any sign of the Japanese. Aside from shelling Kiska Island on August 7th, Louisville departed the theater in late October without seeing much action. By late November, Louisville was back in the South Pacific. After escorting several troop transports to New Caledonia, she proceeded north to the New Hebrides and was assigned to Task Force 18 upon her arrival in Espiritu Santo. On the afternoon of January 27th, Task Force 18 got underway and began heading towards New Georgia Sound, or the Slot, as it was commonly known. Their orders were to conduct a sweep of the Slot on the 29th to screen and cover the unloading of the troop transports at Guadalcanal. The group was tracked by Japanese submarines, who reported its location and movement. As the sun set that evening, Task Force 18 was about 50 miles north of Rennell Island, when Japanese aircraft were detected about 60 miles west of their formation. The approaching Japanese torpedo bombers attacked with the black backdrop of the eastern sky behind them. From this direction, the Japanese were hidden by the night sky, while the ships of Task Force 18 were silhouetted against the twilight of the western horizon. The attack began at 7:19 but failed to strike anything, and one of the attackers was brought down by anti-aircraft fire. 20 minutes later, a second group of Japanese planes attempted an attack on Louisville's task force. This time, however, they had much better luck as they struck the heavy cruiser Chicago twice and the heavy cruiser Wichita once, although the latter failed to explode. Subsequent attacks failed to locate the U.S. ships, and just before midnight, Louisville took the crippled Chicago under tow. She was relieved of this duty around 8 a.m. the next morning by the fleet tug Navajo. Louisville was ordered to retire with the rest of the task force that afternoon, minus Chicago, who was eventually sunk after being struck by 4 more torpedoes later that day. In April, Louisville was ordered back to the Aleutians. She covered the assault and occupation of Attu Island in May, then shelled Kiska Island twice in July. In the early morning hours of July 27th, Louisville was operating about 80 miles south of Kiska when her radar operators began picking up unknown contacts. Her task force formed into a battle disposition, and at 1:13 a.m., Louisville's main battery opened up on the contacts. She was followed in quick succession by the rest of the group. Gun flashes lit up the night for over half an hour, but through it all, no evidence of counteraction was ever detected. It was as if the enemy had just disappeared. Over 500 14-inch and over 400 8-inch shells had been fired at nothing but the sea. This confused incident has gone down in history as the Battle of the Pips, a battle where the enemy was nothing more than radar reflections. Louisville continued patrolling and escorting convoys in the Aleutians until August, when she steamed to the Mare Island Navy Yard for an overhaul. Like her sisters, her forward mast was cut down and her aft mainmast was removed and replaced with a lighter tripod just aft of her second funnel. Louisville received 2 new main battery directors, and all of her 1.1-inch mounts were replaced with quad 40mm Bofors mounts. Her radars were updated, and flagship spaces were also added. She left the yard on Christmas Eve 1943, sporting a brand-new dazzle paint scheme as well. Louisville returned to the fleet in January as the flagship of Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf, and at the end of the month, she shelled several islands in the Marshalls, including Roy Namur. 2 weeks later, Louisville led the Gunfire Support Task Force into action at Eniwetok Atoll. After raking the islands there with gunfire, Louisville joined the Fast Carrier Task Force in March for strikes in the Western Caroline Islands. In April, she supported U.S. Army landings at Hollandia on the northern coast of New Guinea from the 21st to the 24th, then shelled Truk and Sawatan atolls at the end of the month. May brought preparations for the invasion of the Mariana Islands in June, and again, Louisville was the flagship for shore bombardment operations with Admiral Oldendorf embarked. She began with Saipan on the 13th, where she fired on targets almost continuously for 11 days, before moving on to nearby Tinian and Guam in late July. Louisville departed the Marianas in early August for the fleet anchorage at Manus Island, and some much-needed upkeep and rest. Louisville was underway again in early September, this time to support amphibious operations in the Palau Islands, where from September 15th to just about the end of the month, she provided fire support and bombardment duties. After a brief return to Manus in early October, Louisville got underway on the 11th as the flagship of the fire support group for the invasion of Leyte Gulf. On October 18th, Louisville entered Leyte Gulf, and over the next several days she pounded Japanese positions and shore installations ahead of the landings there on the 20th. She spent the next few days providing gunfire support while fighting off numerous air attacks, before taking up station at the northern end of Surigao Strait on the evening of the 24th with the rest of the fire support force of the U.S. 7th Fleet in anticipation of a night surface action with a Japanese force that had been sighted earlier in the day. Louisville, with Admiral Oldendorf embarked, was the lead ship in the column of left flank cruisers. The battle line, consisting of the battleships West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania, was steaming east to west, about 2.5 miles north of the cruiser line. As Louisville's men quietly awaited their prey, they could see distant flashes in the night as first PT boats, then destroyers, made their runs on the Japanese southern force. At around 3 a.m., radars aboard the cruisers and battleships began picking up what was left of the southern force as it steamed north into their trap. At 3:51, the cruiser line was directed by Oldendorf to open fire, and they were soon followed in quick succession by the main battle line. Louisville's range to the nearest target at this time was 15,600 yards. As the U.S. line crossed the T of the Japanese ships, all hell broke loose, and every size of projectile from 6-inch through 16-inch came pouring into their remaining ships. But the show did not last long, as at 4:09 Admiral Oldendorf ordered all ships to cease fire, as several of his destroyers had been hit by friendly fire. Louisville led the column of left flank cruisers south down Surigao Strait just after 4:30 a.m. in an attempt to locate the 3 remaining ships of the 2nd Striking Force, which was steaming behind the southern force. Just before 5:30, Louisville's group could see 2 Japanese ships on fire and a third that showed no sign of damage. Oldendorf, after having checked and ascertained that the force was indeed the enemy, ordered Louisville, Portland, and Denver to engage them. The cruiser Mogami received several direct hits, and although from Louisville she appeared to be fiercely burning, the last of her 9 lives was not yet expended. The left flank cruisers turned north at 5:37 a.m., most likely because Oldendorf was unwilling to risk them to Japanese torpedoes. Louisville departed the Leyte area on October 29th for Ulithi, and after some much-needed upkeep and rest, she was reassigned to the Fast Carrier Task Force and got underway in early December for strikes on the island of Luzon, ahead of landings scheduled there for early January. At the end of December, Louisville was reassigned to the Fire Support Group of Task Force 77 for the invasion of Luzon. As Louisville steamed toward Lingayen Gulf on January 5, 1945, she was struck by a kamikaze, which knocked turret number 2 completely out of action and killed a man, while also injuring 17 others, including her captain, Rex Hicks. A second kamikaze got her the next day, striking the signal bridge on her starboard side. 42 of her men were killed, including Rear Admiral Theodore E. Chandler, the commander of Cruiser Division 4, who was fatally injured while helping sailors fight the massive fires caused by the enemy plane. Another 125 men were wounded. Despite damage inflicted upon her, Louisville still managed to shell the beaches and shoot down several enemy planes before withdrawing on the 9th and proceeding to Mare Island for repairs. With her repairs completed, Louisville got underway on April 10th to begin the trek across the Pacific to the combat zone. She delivered some of Admiral Halsey's staff to the battleship Missouri at Guam before joining Task Force 54, the gunfire and covering force, off Okinawa. Over the next month, she provided close fire support to the troops ashore while also fending off numerous kamikaze attacks. On June 5th, she was struck again by another kamikaze. 8 sailors on a quad 40mm mount were killed, and 45 others were injured. Her forward-most stack was bent, and one of her seaplanes was torn off of its catapult. Louisville was back on the gun line by June 9th and remained on station until ordered back to Pearl Harbor for repairs on the 15th. When the war came to a close on August 15th, Louisville was in Hawaiian waters getting ready to redeploy to the Western Pacific. As such, she got underway on the 16th for Guam, with Rear Admiral T.G.W. Settle embarked, then proceeded to Darien in Manchuria to supervise the evacuation of Allied POWs. Afterwards, she steamed to Tsingato, China, where Japanese vessels in that area were surrendered to her. Louisville then escorted the surrendered vessels to Incheon, Korea. In late October, she got underway for the United States and proceeded to the Philadelphia Navy Yard, where she was decommissioned in June of 1946 and placed in the Atlantic Reserve Fleet. Louisville remained there for the next 13 years before being stricken on March 1, 1959, and subsequently sold for scrap in September of that same year. Today, all that is left of the Lady Lou is her bell, which is on display at the Navy Operational Support Center in Louisville, Kentucky, and her original turret number 2. It was removed from Louisville at Mare Island and replaced after she was struck by the kamikaze in January of 1945. The turret eventually was repaired, but with the end of the war, it was no longer needed. After sitting for over a decade, it was taken to the Nevada test site and converted into a rotating radiation detector to collect data on nuclear tests. Louisville was awarded 13 battle stars for her World War II service. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe. I really love what I do here, and this helps me out, and I greatly appreciate it. Once again, thank you for watching.